I want to bring in our team of NBC News reporters, senior White House correspondent Kelly O'Donnell, who's outside the White House, and also with us, NBC News Justice reporter Ryan Reilly. So, Ryan, how extraordinary to see President Trump there at the Justice Department. Of course, as a candidate, he was facing multiple indictments. They have now been dropped. He says he's launching a far-reaching investigation into what he referred to as wrongdoing at the Justice Department under the previous administration. Talk about what your key takeaways were.
Yeah, as you mentioned up top, speeches of presidents at the Justice Department are very rare. It's not often that they speak from that Great Hall. The only time in my 15 years covering DOJ that I can remember was President Biden, and that was a much different kind of speech. Obviously, what you have here is someone who was a criminal defendant just a few months ago, sort of taking a victory lap against sort of the agency and the prosecutors that went after him and saying, that those days were no longer going to come back. He made a little bit of news there talking about rebuilding the FBI at its current location along Pennsylvania Avenue. It had been thought to have maybe been going out to the suburbs, but now he's saying it's going to be there. But also talking about Kash Patel's plan to really dramatically shrink how many people are going to be working at FBI headquarters. The idea is that they're going to shrink headquarters, send more people out into the field. And that's something that's been happening at the Justice Department as well. But, for him to make those direct attacks on Jack Smith, the former special counsel, of course, and talk about the raid in Mar-a-Lago, as well as the other cases against him, while you have a Justice Department, that is led in part by one of his former criminal defense attorneys at the Deputy Attorney General level, was really, I think, quite a remarkable sight there. And it speaks to sort of a lot of the optics. There are just these normal things that you see as a Justice Department reporter that might not register for the average viewer. But the first time we saw that was Pam Bondi, the way that she handled her first press conference. Today, we sort of have these sort of props right on the stage there. What was seized by the DEA, DEA evidence sitting out there. It's just not typically how we've seen the Justice Department handle these things before. And of course, normally there would be the discouragement of this sort of political speech within the Justice Department. But there's parts of this that have really seemed like a campaign rally. Sort of him calling out people in the audience and telling stories that we've heard when he actually has been on the campaign trail before. So it is definitely a remarkable moment, I think, in American history, and certainly for the FBI. This speech that President Trump is giving in the Great Hall today, Kristen.
Oh, Ryan, great distillation of what we just heard. Let's head to Kelly O'Donnell at the White House. Ryan, stand by for us. Kelly, what were your key takeaways? Again, it's very rare to have a president speak at the Justice Department, and we know that President Trump has this extraordinary history with the Justice Department, given that he was the subject of multiple indictments that have now been dropped effectively since he is the current commander-in-chief.
It is striking, and it's important to point out how this is a real departure from what has been Washington tradition, certainly in our lifetime, and going back really to the Watergate era, where the Attorney General was indicted and went to prison for crimes associated with President Richard Nixon's efforts with Watergate. And since that time, having separation, where a president would often seldom even speak to his Attorney General, and certainly would not be going to the building, with the exception of perhaps some courtesy visit, but not a showpiece like today's event is for President Trump, where he is openly setting a new course for the kind of crime fighting that he believes is part of the electoral win that put him into office, with going after drugs and international cartels and those kinds of things. But threaded throughout what we've heard in what is a typically lengthy address for the president is, again, going after those who he perceives as his political enemies, those who he believes did him some harm, talking about rooting out bad actors. There have already been a number of dismissals at the Department of Justice for people who were doing their jobs to prosecute either the January 6th cases. Those were voluminous, and Ryan had been really out front on a lot of that reporting, as well as those associated with the special counsel Jack Smith and the indictments against the president himself. So while it might be typical for a president to go to another part of the executive branch and to speak to those who are there, again, doing that at the Department of Justice is unusual, and the president knows that and is embracing the fact that he is casting his shadow very firmly over the DOJ and embracing the people he installed there in order to reshape the vision of a smaller, leaner, and in some ways one that reflects his personal views. And at times that's been at odds with the law, because we've seen how a number of the president's executive actions and some of the firing that's gone on at various departments has been challenged in the courts. So there's a lot of tension points here, and today really stands out.
It sure does, Kelly, and you really take me to my next question, Ryan. Let me go back to you. Kelly talks about the fact that in his 50 days in office so far, we have seen President Trump take some actions against some of those who are perceived to be his political rivals. Throughout the course of the campaign, he talked about this word retribution. He was pressed repeatedly. What did he mean by it? He said his success would be his retribution. I pressed him when I interviewed him just before he was sworn into office. Would he direct his attorney general? Would he direct his FBI director to target specific political enemies? He said he would not do that. How do you see this playing out now that we are approaching 50 days in office?
Yeah, I mean, one of the key names there is Ed Martin, who is the interim U.S. attorney for the District of Columbia. And in that position, he's overseen, first of all, that entire Capitol Siege unit, which was working on these hundreds of January 6 cases that instantly went away with a stroke of a pen on Donald Trump's first day in office. That section has been entirely disbanded. They fired all of the attorneys the prosecutors there that they could, who were still under that first 2 years where they were probationary employees at first. I watched them have to go back into the Justice Department, or rather into the U.S. Attorney's Office, and get all of their things and bring them out. And that culture has really continued, right? You had demotions of those individuals who went after January 6 cases. One of them actually just wrote a letter that I obtained this week. He was resigning from the department and was writing that he was going to be proud to tell this history and make sure that history knew the story of what happened on January 6th, something he's going to be proud to tell his son, who he's expecting in a couple of months here. But there's really this culture within the Justice Department right now of real fear about what this is going to mean going forward. People are just very concerned for their jobs because the civil service protections are sort of fading away, right? There's a lot of worry that just basically someone could destroy your career very quickly. In fact, we saw that just the other week where someone liked a LinkedIn post and then were suddenly walked out of the Justice Department. So there's been a lot of really concerning measures within DOJ.
Incredibly insightful. Appreciate your staying on top of all of those twists and turns for us. Ryan Reilly, Kelly O'Donnell, let me go back to you. This speech caps a week in which we have seen volatility on Wall Street, jitters on Main Street, as well as, quite frankly, inside the administration over the president's economic policy, the fact that he has imposed a number of different tariffs against the United States' largest trading partners, biggest allies. What is your sense, Kelly, because you've had a chance to question him throughout the week? He has struck a note of defiance with you, certainly no indication he's planning to back down on any of this, right?
He has a very high tolerance for the chaotic effects of his decision making. When I say chaotic effects, he will very much defend that he can deploy tariffs, that he can fire federal workers, that he can call out federal workers for not coming into the office. He can challenge leaders like President Zelensky of Ukraine and try to somehow woo Putin to the negotiating table. He can do all of these different things with a lot of rebound effects that affect the markets, affect allies and relationships, affect how American citizens are trying to figure out what this will mean for their budgets and their pocketbooks. So his high tolerance for those chaotic effects and the shock and awe, which is a term that the administration embraced coming in. They wanted a lot of activity. They wanted a lot of upheaval in order to swiftly remake the administration and the federal government. So the president pushes back hard when challenged about tariffs or policies, acknowledges recession is a possibility, economy, does not believe that the markets are a reflection, as he did in the first term, of an immediate snapshot of how he is doing. He says markets go up and go down now. So there is certainly a determined kind of approach the president is using, even as criticism, questions, and fears bubble up as a result.
Yeah, and we should note, we are going to have a new NBC News poll coming out on Sunday on Meet the Press. Steve Kornacki will be with us to break down all of the results. What is the president's overall approval rating? What is his approval rating as it relates to the economy? Kelly O'Donnell, Ryan Reilly, thank you so much.
Thanks for watching. Stay updated about breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or follow us on social media.